In this lesson, we're going to further customize the rest of our scene with just a few changes and a few more effects that we'll be adding in. And we'll finally finish up our entire project and watch it back to see what we've created throughout this course. Okay, so we left off here kind of right in between the last transition from our woman running piece of footage to kind of the hero image of our shoe. So let's go ahead and come right in here to where the transition of our woman kind of goes into this piece right here where it's very much more glitchy than this right here. So right about there. And we'll go over here to our project, grab that flow wide again. Maybe pull that up just a bit. And this time, instead of having this go just somewhere in the middle, I'm actually going to start it at the beginning, just like that. And let's go ahead and change our blending mode to add, just like that, so we can see through it. And we'll go ahead and stretch that out so it's visible the whole time, just like this. We've got it at the top and the bottom, basically. And now what I want to do is to kind of just have this be much faster than what we had before. And I also want it to fade into the animation of the shoe just a bit. So right when the shoe hits the ground is when I want this to end. Maybe just a little bit more, just right about there. So let's trim it. But instead of actually cutting it, I want it to go faster. So we can use a slightly different method than just cutting it to use those additional frames we have past our current time indicator to make it look like it's going faster. And that's going to be the stretch function. So even if we toggle our switches back by hitting that button, we don't get the stretch over here on the side. We actually have to add that in as one of the columns that we get in all of these settings here. So you can just right click up here along the top where we've got all these different columns on our timeline, go to columns and choose stretch from the very bottom, and that'll just add that in there for you. And I'm just going to turn this down until the edge of it meets my current time indicator. So what this does is it makes the layer shorter, and it also is going to make it faster. So let's watch this play back. You can see it's moving much more quickly than any of those other times that we saw that flow happening before. Really nice. But one of the problems that we get with this is that it really appears to be very crisp. So I think it would be nice to make it look like it's going faster over time to add some blur. And we can do that with an effect called directional blur. So when things move faster, you get that motion blur, but because we're not actually moving this, we're just changing the timing, we won't be able to just use After Effects native motion blur that it provides us. So to add in directional blur, you'll want to just come up here to your effects and presets and type in direct. It looks like DIRE will be the only effect that has that in its name. So we'll just go ahead and grab directional blur and drop it onto the flow. Now nothing changes right away, and this is a good example of something that's just an effect. It's not a preset because it doesn't combine multiple effects, but we can start to change this effect by dragging the property of the blur length. And you can see that gets blurrier and blurrier as I do that. It's probably a little too blurry. And you'll notice also that right now the blur is kind of up and down looking. So it's blurring this way. And that makes sense because the line is at 0, so it's pointing straight up. So if I bring this around to, say, 90 degrees, we can just type that in there. Now it's going to be a horizontal blur, which makes more sense because that's the way that it's flowing. So what I want to do is show you how to set a couple of keyframes. So I want this blur to become more intense over time. So I'm going to come over here to the very last frame that this flow is visible. And we can just zoom in to see exactly where that is. It looks like that's going to be right there. And I think this looks pretty good at about 18. So we'll go ahead and to set the keyframe, you just want to click the stopwatch. So that set a keyframe on this frame for this amount of blur. And we can drop that down, go into your effects and go into your directional blur. And you can see we have a little keyframe right there. Now if we zoom back out and go to the beginning, we can set another keyframe with a lower amount of blur. So we'll just go to the very beginning of that layer and pull this all the way down to 0. So it's going to start out with no blur at all and then get blurrier and blurrier as time goes on, and then it'll just stop. So I think that looks pretty good as an effect for this, but I think we could push it even further by maybe adding a small glitch to it. So let's trim this layer, cut it, and have that second piece kind of on that layer above it by selecting the layer, hitting Control-Shift-D. And we'll go into our Bad TV presets and choose Weak, drop that on there. And so basically what we get is this effect. And I think instead of just having it disappear, we might even want to fade it out over time. So what we can do here is change the transparency of this over time. So transparency is going to be a property that is inherent to every layer in After Effects. If you want to drop this down, go into Transform. You see that we have all of these properties here on our timeline. And the opacity property is what's going to control how bright or visible something is. So if I take this all the way down to 0, you can see I can't even really see the layer anymore. So I want to have this at 100 at the beginning. So to set a keyframe, we're at the very beginning of that little layer. We'll hit the stopwatch, then move to the end of the layer and turn it down to 0. We'll just scrub forward. And you can see how it just sort of slowly disappears over time instead of what we've done so far, which is basically just cutting everything. Now we did have our slow fade on preset, but that was specific to text, so it wouldn't really have worked with this kind of a piece of footage. So sometimes you just have to manually put those keyframes in by hand, and you just really need to know what property controls what to make it appear that way over time. So what we just did was very simple, just an opacity keyframe change from 100 to 0 over a few frames here at the end. Okay, so now let's kind of zoom out and take a look at what we have here for everything. So I'm just going to hit RAM Preview to play this through. And I think overall, this looks very, very good. We might want to do something at the very end with the shoe, maybe add some glitchiness to that, but I think just watching this, it looks really nice. Okay, so that went all the way through, and like I said, I think the very end of this could maybe look a little bit better. So instead of just having it end like this, I think we should have something that maybe kind of exits this out. And since we've been working with that old TV effect, I'm going to show you how to set a few keyframes on a different property, not the opacity property, but the scale property. So what we need basically is for this part of our shoe, kind of ending here, to last a little bit longer, right there, where it blacks out, so that we really can control it or have something to do with it to exit this off. So what I want to do is basically just take this still image or a freeze frame of this and have that to play around with. So to freeze frame it, you're going to select the layer, right click it, go up to time and choose freeze frame. Now what's going to happen is now we don't get that motion in the shoe at all. It froze, basically froze the whole clip. So I'm going to undo that, and basically we want to be able to see all this animation. We actually need to duplicate this layer before we freeze it. So select your layer, hit Control D to duplicate, and we'll just build this right underneath here. Now we'll select the second one now that we've duplicated it, right click again, go to time, choose freeze frame. And now we can just extend that because it's the same all the way across if it's the same frame. Just trim that there. So now what it's basically going to do is just kind of end on that last frame. And let's make sure that those, there we go, that those butt right up next to each other. We don't get a little black out there. So it just basically stops. So what I want to do is kind of have a glitch happen right here on the edge. So let's put our TV weak on this. So it'll start to glitch. And then we can exit this out with some of those scale frames like I was talking about. So this is going to be a pretty easy little keyframe animation. You don't have to worry about it being too difficult, but I'm going to talk you through it. So select your layer. And let's go ahead and look at that scale property. So you want to toggle that down so you can see transform, bring that down, and scale is going to be right here. So we want to go ahead and set a keyframe for it as it is here at the beginning. So we'll go ahead and hit that stopwatch. Then let's move forward to about halfway through the animation, and I want this to basically come down like that. So almost like an old TV turning off. And then we'll come over here to the end and pull it in. So then we can pull it in just like that. So it sort of just turns into a tiny little dot. And by setting those two different keyframes, instead of just making it this size at the end, it kind of hits that point halfway through where the top and bottom go in and then very much to the center. Now, one thing that I think could be nice is to add a glow effect to this part at the end. So let's come back in here, kind of see what we've got there. And let's just say like right about here where it really gets very skinny, can't really see what's going on anymore. Let's add our glow effect. So we'll just come right there. We'll do our Control-Shift-D with our layer selected again. And just this very last part will make glow. So you just come up here to Effects and Presets, type in glow, and it's going to be that stylized glow. We'll just drop it onto that layer. You can see how it just kind of brightens it up. Now what's great about glow is that you can drop on multiple instances of the glow effect to really start making it super, super bright, pushing those white areas. So you can kind of see how that looks over time. Pretty interesting. And another thing that I think we could change is because this is actually moving in After Effects, we've got the property scale keyed, we can use After Effects native motion blur to kind of help this look a little more smooth instead of this weird skewed image of the shoe. So to turn on After Effects motion blur, there's two things you have to do. You want to come over here to your motion blur switch for that layer. So we'll go ahead and turn that on, just like that. And then you have to turn it on for your whole comp. With anything that has that switch set, it will blur. So once I hit that, you can see that it gets a little more blurry as that moves. And then we can do the same thing for this piece as well. We'll select this piece right here. We'll hit the motion blur switch. And because the comp switch was already turned on, you could really easily see kind of how that blurs over time. So I like that. That's pretty interesting. Now, one of the problems you might run into is that these keyframes, we set them first and then we cut the layer. So if you change the property value of any of these keyframes, like let's say you want to make this a perfect 3 by 3, you can see that nothing changed because even though we changed it for this set of keyframes, the set on this layer up here, if we bring this down, take a look at those scale properties, they're still going to be the same 3.8 by 3.9. So you'd have to change it in both places for that animation to still look smooth. So that's a little bit of the difference that you might run into there when using this method. Okay, so I think that this looks pretty great. We've done a really fantastic job of editing this all together. I'm going to go ahead and hit Ram Preview. We can watch this through one final time just to see all of the handiwork that you've done throughout this course. You can just imagine what some really nice glitchy sound effects would do for this piece, just to really push that forward. I think it looks great. If you wanted to, you might want to speed up this little transition at the very end, maybe if you wanted the scale to happen faster, but I think overall it looks pretty good. So in our next lesson, we're going to reach the most challenging part of this course, which is going to be the Volume 1 project assignment. So we're going to be going over a few of the parameters and the assets that you'll be getting, and we're going to challenge you to create something similar to what we've created in the previous lessons, but with completely different assets, and really just challenging you to use the skills and the techniques that you've learned throughout this course and create something completely on your own. So stick around and we're going to go over those tips in the next lesson.